Everybody loves Rome these days. Everyone can name emperors, historians, and maybe even a couple famous battles. But one thing that I feel like doesn't get nearly enough attention is the central pillar of Roman culture, their religion. Ever wonder why the Romans just copied the Greek gods? And why did they change their names? Were they really hoping no one would notice that Jupiter is basically identical to Zeus? You may have heard that Romans didn't care about faith, just ritual, but how does that even make sense? Why would you burn offerings to something that you didn't believe existed? I had some questions myself when I was looking into the spread of Christianity, a video which is still coming, I promise. But as I started to dig through the evidence that we have for Roman theology, I started to realize that many of the things I thought were true weren't. This isn't just the fault of pop historians or trusting people on the internet, though. The ancient Roman writers themselves got a lot of this stuff wrong. But this isn't going to be your standard HistoryTube video. I'm not just going to tell you what happened over a series of pictures. No, I'm going to stand in front of them. I'm going to show you. We're going to be looking at, just in this video alone, well over 100 pieces of evidence, the vast majority of them primary sources, although a couple modern scholars and archaeologists as well. If you're curious about any of my sources or pictures, I have a companion document linked in the video description. Anytime I bring up a source, I'll put a number on screen like this, and that number will correspond to something in the companion document, which will have a direct link to the source I'm talking about. Usually I do this so that you can feel more confident about my claims, but this time I'm actually kind of doing the opposite. You see, what we're trying to determine here is what was the belief system of a culture spanning 1,000 years that was constantly adding and losing new people. It's a very, very complicated thing. So though this series is going to present a theory based on the evidence that we have, know that there are other theories out there, which I'll link in the companion document where appropriate, so you can look into them more if it interests you. And if you don't want to look into them more, just know that I'm completely right and no one has ever disagreed with me. So with all that preamble out of the way, let's get down to business. This video is going to cover the Archaic Period, or like 900 1000-ish BC to like 450-ish BC. This period is known for having almost no written records, and so we're stuck mostly with the archaeological record. Unfortunately for us, Rome has been rebuilt and expanded and dug up so many times that there really isn't much evidence that survives from this period. But luckily for us, the Eternal City is not the only place we can look. You see, Rome began as just another city in an area of Italy known as Latium. This was an area controlled by the Latin League, which was a loose collection of city-states that shared some amount of language and culture with each other. And so, we can take a look at some of these other cities, which have been better preserved, to try and get a sense of what Latin or Roman religion might have been like in these early days. Le Fiere, and I'm very sorry to all my Italian listeners, is a small town in Italy, also called a human settlement by Google for some reason, near an incredibly important group of archaeological sites, though in this case important just means old. These include religious sites which go back as far as the year 1000 BC, but we're going to start our journey by looking at the town of Satricum. As far back as we can tell, people who lived in this town, or Acropolis if you want to be fancy, had this really weird habit of taking these perfectly good objects and just chucking them into pits. Many of these objects are related to weaving, as well as everyone's favorite, local handmade pottery. Towards the end of the 8th century BC, they'd build a wooden house in front of one of these pits, and if you haven't guessed it by now, this is one of the oldest temple sites we know of in Latium. And it remained in use for quite a while. It was actually rebuilt twice, first with stone and then with more stone. It was potentially first dedicated to a wool or weaving deity, something that we can surmise from the looms and other weaving objects that we find in these votive deposits. Vocabulary. Votive offerings were things offered in fulfillment of a vow. Votive offerings are not unique to Latium. We actually find them all over the world. But the interesting thing about Latin offerings is later writers would indicate they would only be given after the deity had fulfilled their end of the vow. In fact, you have likely made a votive offering at least once in your life. Think about a wishing well. You put money into the well with the hope that that money will be considered sufficient enough that the well will fulfill your wish, which, you know, is a move. I will mention this shouldn't be viewed as transactional insofar as the Romans were concerned. That misconception is actually one of my biggest pet peeves, but the evidence to explain that will come later, so just keep that in the back of your mind for right now. The votive offerings didn't stay the same for this entire time period, though. In fact, they didn't even confine themselves to one pit. We found 3, creatively named votive deposit 1, 2, and 3. The first pit, mostly in use from the 9th to the 4th centuries, mostly contained things like jewelry and combs and local handmade pottery, although towards the end, it would start containing some Greek pottery. The second deposit, in use from the 4th and 5th centuries BC, would contain all that as well as statuettes, mostly of nursing mothers, and steels. The third site was mostly in use from the 4th and 3rd centuries and contained some of the grandest offerings, like full Greek vases. Now I know what you're thinking, but Port, how did they have this Greek architecture and pottery if they hadn't had contact with Greece yet? And you're right, this isn't the Hellenistic period where Rome and Greece had more direct contact, but Greece had been influencing the Italian peninsula since well before the 1st century BC. The important takeaway here is that whatever identity may have existed before the Second Temple, by that time, they were already starting to adopt some elements of non-Latin culture. While we can't strictly know who the original deity might have been, we know that by at least the 7th century, it was likely dedicated to Mater Matuta, the Dawn Mother. This comes from later writers such as Livy, but importantly also inscriptions found at the site that unambiguously refer to her. It's actually kind of interesting what inscriptions we can find in these deposits. There's stuff written in Greek, Latin, and Etruscan. It's interesting to think about what might have led this site to being such like a cultural crossroads. It probably was just trade. I'm probably overthinking it. You can check the companion doc if you want to read more about this. I don't want to spend the entirety of this video on a single votive deposit site. Many of the votive deposit sites we found in Latium would eventually have temples on. Now, these other sites don't really show us anything that Satricum doesn't, so to wrap up the Latin portion here, let's move on to the center of Latin life, the city of Lavinium. Like many other towns, it has a lot of votive deposit sites, but what's most interesting to us is a tomb and a series of 13 shrines, all dating from like the 6th century BC all the way to like the 3rd century BC.
Interestingly, there's a very old inscription we found on a tablet mentioning the names Castor and Pollux, the divine Greek twins we get Gemini from. This is dated to the 5th century BC, but most interestingly, it is written in Greek, not Latin.
The super interesting Greek influence, though, can be seen in the tomb of Aeneas. Actually, the heroon of Aeneas, but I looked it up. It just means tomb. Like it's not a tomb. It's a area dedicated as a tomb that's not actually a tomb. But then I felt like if I say heroon, but then I'm here now and I'm already explaining it. Anyway, don't worry about it. Aeneas is a character in Homer's Iliad. He's the cousin of Hector, Prince of Troy. His mother is supposedly Aphrodite, and he's so favored by the gods, they actually directly intervene to save him several times. Poseidon even claims that Aeneas will become the king of the Trojans. You may already know that Aeneas would be considered by later Roman writers the founder of the Latin tribes. They actually considered him their ancestor. But what you may not know is that this is not the only monument dedicated to Aeneas in Italy from around this time. Now, his tomb in Lavinium was originally just the tomb of some rich guy. Maybe he was the ruler of the tribe or, some famous cultural war hero or something like that. But either way, it was rededicated to Aeneas sometime in the 6th century BC. And around this time is when the first of the 13 shrines would be built as well. We don't exactly know who they were to, but we do have some ideas. Two of the big ones are the De Penates and the Pater Indiges. These are classifications of deities rather than specific deities, but what that classification meant is actually lost to time. Even later Roman writers weren't entirely sure what they referred to. Cicero was pretty sure that the Penates were somehow related to the storeroom, which was called the Penus. These shrines were built over the course of hundreds of years, from the 6th to 3rd centuries BC. And interestingly, they all faced east. This is something that we would see in a lot of Greek temples from around this time period, but interestingly, we wouldn't necessarily see in Roman temples from a little bit later. This influence may not have come directly from Greece, but we'll get there a little bit later. The important thing to note is that essentially you have all these votive deposits and all this Latin culture, and then suddenly, from the 7th to 6th centuries BC, there's an explosion of Greek and Etruscan influence. Now, I know we're talking a lot about adopting elements from other cultures, and this shouldn't be taken to imply that the Latins had no culture. They very much had a culture, but this concept of kind of adopting things from other cultures is going to play a pretty big role in this going forward. Obviously, there's no record of what, chants or rituals or ceremonies or anything went along with these offerings from around this time. So all we can really safely say is that Roman gods enjoyed getting offerings, which I know, big revelation, but we're getting started. Calm down. We can assume that there was some form of ritual with these offerings based on the fact that there were rituals associated with later offerings. Although if you want to assume that they just kind of silently walked up and chucked something into a pit and walked away. Technically, there's no evidence to disprove that. Jörg Rübke, whose name I'm probably butchering, but whose book Pantheon was fantastically useful in making this series, has an interesting theory that I think is a good place for us to start. He believes that much of Rome's religious practice had less to do with worship, as we think of it today, and much more to do with communication.
Rübke argues the Romans saw their gods as either the masters or embodiments of natural phenomena in the world, which he calls invisible agents. Now, that core idea comes from later writers, notably Cicero in the 1st century BC, who outright says as much. Baked into this idea, though, Rübke sees a certain element of uncertainty. Not in the sense of Romans thought they were wrong, in fact, plenty of later writers would boast about how correct Roman worship was, but more in the way that you couldn't directly communicate with these forces, and therefore couldn't really know the being you were talking to, or even, more relevant to our exploration, how to talk to them. For Rübke, Roman rituals were the answer. The words of a prayer, the actions of a ritual, these were the ways in which you communicated with those natural forces. As to why these rituals and not others, well, we'll come back to that more next video, but for now the answer is because it works so far.
Now, I want to go back to that earlier note of caution that this should not be viewed as it being transactional. The Romans didn't think of this like, well, we sacrificed more bulls to Jupiter, so Jupiter favored us more than anyone else. It was a lot more about the relationship they formed with the gods. Some of the oldest Latin writings we still have are plays, and one of the oldest playwrights we have surviving is Plautus. He tells a story in one of his plays about a household spirit who is tasked by the owner of that house with watching over a little bit of money that owner wants to pass on to his heirs right before his death. However, the man's heir neglects the sacrifices to this spirit. In the end, the spirit kind of says, well, fine, if you're not going to pay me my respect, then you're not going to get this money. However, that heir's heir does make sure to properly sacrifice to the spirit, bringing back the rituals and offerings that have been neglected. And so the spirit rewards that descendant by showing them where the money is. Note, they don't know that there's even any money to ask the spirit for. The spirit just does it because they feel respected, because they like the person. And you actually intrinsically already understand this. To use a modern example, say your friend's car breaks down. It's in the shop and they come to you and say, hey, can you give me a ride to work tomorrow? I'll buy you a drink the next time we go out. Now, you're not going to look at that and see it as them paying you for a ride with a drink. And in fact, if you're good enough friends, you might even say, don't even worry about the drink, man. I'll give you the ride, no problem. On the flip side, if a coworker that you don't particularly like has the same issue and comes to you and says, hey man, can you give me a ride to work tomorrow? I'll buy you 2 drinks. You're probably not going to be like, well, I'm way more inclined to do this than I was for my friend. The drink is just a polite way of acknowledging that they're putting you out, that they're asking you to go out of your way. And that's the same way we should view these votive deposits. It's just establishing respectful relationships with the gods.
But as I said, it's never so straightforward, so let me give you another theory as to how this kind of practice might have evolved as well. George Dumezil is another scholar who's been quite influential in this area of study, and I'm going to poison the well here by calling him the fun kind of racist. Dumezil claims that the idea that the Roman religion evolved out of something like animism, much like the Native Americans, Asians, and Africans, is frankly laughable. That the clear complexity of the later Roman religious structure implies that it must have been inherited from some other older civilization. He never explains how that older civilization had developed this stuff, but, like I said, fun kind of racist. This follows the idea that the Romans, as well as the Greeks, and even many of the Indian states, all descended from the singular group known as the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Now, I know I'm ragging on Dumezil a bit here, but to be fair, his theory isn't just completely made up out of thin air. The concept of the Proto-Indo-European peoples does exist in modern scholarship and is actually widely accepted. However, importantly, not in a cultural sense. The main piece of evidence supporting the existence of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and I'm going to get very tired of saying that, is language. And you can kind of see this map here explaining how a migration pattern could have given rise to all the languages from, Hindi to German, from this sort of single source. Dumezil, I think, specifically talks about rex, for Latin word for king, with Raj, the Indian word for king. Again, I'm not like a linguist, so forgive me if I'm not giving the best version of this argument, but I will link some stuff in the companion doc if you want to read a little bit more about this. Importantly, a language is not a culture. Just ask Brazil and Portugal, or Spain and
Wow, 10% of all countries on Earth? That's actually kind of impressive. Also keep in mind that although certain mythological tropes may appear here and there, for example, Thor and Zeus are often brought up, thunder gods that kind of take a very central role in the mythology of a certain religion, that doesn't necessarily imply a shared culture from the get-go. The concept of like a curvy fertility goddess, for example, we can find all the way from sub-Saharan Africa to Italy. So it's not quite fair to just say that like, oh, these two, groups had thunder gods and they have similar names. Therefore, their mythology and culture and everything was inherited from, a central group. There's a lot more I can say about this, but obviously it's not the point of this video and I don't want to spend the whole time talking about it. So I will just link some more sources in the companion doc if you want to read people on both sides of this argument. But we're going to forge ahead under the assumption that even though there may have been some shared tropes or symbols or stuff like that between the various cultures, the Roman religion that we're examining grew out of the Latin people who were born in Italy, not any of their Anatolian or steppe ancestors. So now let's move on to Rome proper. The origins of Rome are, like everything else we've talked about, not exactly solid. There are quite a few theories, but for our purposes, all you really got to know is that Rome had actually been occupied basically since like the Bronze Age. And the kind of Latin identity of Rome emerged in like the 8th century, 9th century BC, somewhere in that range. One of the oldest structures we know of is a stone wall in Rome that dates from like 750 to 700 BC. Found with shards of Greek pottery. You can't get away from it. Now, stone walls can be built for any number of reasons, but a really common one is marking your territory from your neighbors. And around that time, those neighbors would have been the Sabines. Or, well, maybe. See, the Sabines are actually a great example of how peering back into this archaic period of Roman history gets real complicated real quick. You see, the ancient historians, notably Livy, Plutarch, and I think also Dionysius of Halicarnassus, I'll check that one, but they all write that the Sabines basically merged with the Roman peoples almost immediately after the city's founding. This was basically accepted by scholars as just completely true up until the 1970s, but now there's actually some doubt. The reason for modern scholars' skepticism is because the few graves we've excavated from before 600 BC don't really have many differences from the graves we've excavated in the more authentically Latin parts of Rome. But in spite of that, all the ancient writers claim that they got a ton of their gods from the Sabines, and plenty of Romans trace their ancestry through to the Sabines, including Julius Caesar himself. The 1st century BC poet and historian and grammarian, people had a lot of jobs back then, Varro, claimed that this entire list of gods came from the Sabines. Rome's founding myth even claims their second king was a Sabine, and that guy taught them all of the best rituals to worship the god. So there's no archaeological evidence, but later Romans seem pretty convinced of this fact. So what do we make of that? Well, luckily for us, we can turn to a different type of evidence: etymology. The Sabines were not a Latin tribe. They were actually descended from the Umbri people located over here. They didn't speak Latin, they spoke Umbrian, and some of their words made it into Latin as loanwords. Most relevant to us is the word quirite, meaning citizen, which is also the root of one of the most important gods in the Archaic period, the god Quirinus. Quirinus was later seen as the deified version of Romulus, but the ancient sources tell us that he was originally a Sabine war god from the city of Curis. Although I looked really hard and I could not actually find any evidence that the city of Curis ever had a shrine to Quirinus. I looked into this a lot. If you can find one, please let me know, and I'll put a note in the companion doc, but for all I know, this is also just BS. If you haven't heard of him, it's not really that surprising. He doesn't have a Greek equivalent, and he didn't really have the staying power into the late empire that certain gods like Janus had, but there is some interesting evidence that around now, he might have been on the same level of importance as Jupiter. Our old friend George Dumézil actually postulates something called the Archaic Triad, or three gods that kind of sat at the top of the Roman state religion, which would be Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus. Later in Rome's history, we'd know about the Capitoline Triad, which would sit at the top of Rome's religious order, composed of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Though this is still debated, it does have support in the scholarly community, mostly based on how the Roman priesthood was structured. Roman priests were called pontiffs, and the head priest was called the Pontifex Maximus. I know, creative. But there were 4 other priests which actually ranked higher than him. the sacred king, or Rex Sacrorum, and the priests to Jupiter, Mars, and Queer-eye-nus. In fact, a later grammarian, Sextus Pompeius Festus, would actually state,
This is the order of the priests, mirroring the order of the gods. The highest is the sacred king, then the priest of Jupiter, after him the priest of Mars, fourth that of Queer-eye-nus, fifth the Pontifex Maximus. This was written in the 2nd century AD, so this organizational structure persisted hundreds of years after the Capitoline Triad had been introduced.
and, as we've discussed, other Latin cities were certainly not opposed to adopting foreign deities as their own. So it stands to reason that Rome might have found this foreign Sabine deity and taken it into their own pantheon.
While later Romans would credit the Sabine with introducing various other gods and practices, the evidence for these is a bit more tenuous, though admittedly it'd be a bit odd if the influence stopped at a single deity.
So now let's move on to the third and biggest influence on little baby Rome, the Etruscans. The Etruscans and their land of Etria was mostly situated in northern Italy. However, over the course of their empire, they expanded pretty far to the south, getting all the way to Rome. Rupke again claimed that there was some pretty sweet farmland, like just south of Rome, and Rome also just geographically happens to be one of the best places to cross the Tiber River, which kind of cuts Italy in half unless you want to go all the way up into the mountains. So the Etruscans just kind of kept conquering down and then just got to Rome and stopped there. I couldn't really find a ton of evidence to back that up either way, and that's sort of, I mean, there'd be speculation regardless, because it's not like the Etruscans wrote down, we are going to get this really cool farmland, but then we got to Rome and we just stopped because we said, oh, well, whatever. So where was I going?
Etruscan influence on Rome is far clearer than that of the Sabines, though, most notably in their language, with Latins adopting several letters and sounds from their Etruscan neighbors.
The Romans believed their last couple kings had been Etruscan, but we actually didn't have any evidence of this until we uncovered the oldest inscription in the city of Rome itself, the inscription on the lapis niger, the black stone. This inscription, uncovered at the beginning of the 20th century, is written in Old Latin and is also quite heavily fragmented, which means translating it is kind of difficult. There are a few people who've offered a few different suggestions, but I find this is the most cohesive one.
Whosoever will violate this grove, let him be cursed. Let no one dump refuse, nor throw a body. Let it be lawful for the king to sacrifice a cow in atonement. Let him fine one fine for each offense. Whom the king will fine, let him give cows. Let the king have a herald. Let him yoke a team, 2 heads, sterile, along the route. Him who will not sacrifice with a young animal in lawful assembly in grove, whereupon it cuts off.
Interesting to note, the king is the one who needs to sacrifice an atonement if the grove is violated. This implies the king had some sort of divinely significant relation to the gods. This is dated to the beginning or mid 6th century BC. We're pretty sure that the Etruscans were in Rome by then. The archaeological record indicates quite a few Etruscan artifacts. If you recall a few minutes ago, the highest ranking priest in the Roman religion was the Rex Sacrorum. Now, the scholarly consensus is that this was introduced to replace the role that the king would have had in Roman rituals. And judging from the Romans' own accounts and the archaeological record we have, this king may well have been an Etruscan, implying the religious head of Rome might have been Etruscan. And given that this is an order directed at the people living in the area, it would make sense to write it in a language that they'd understand. Although, you know, it was the 500s BC, so probably not a lot of them could read, but, you know, hey. Recall that by the end of the Archaic period, Romans would have a new triad heading up their religion, the one to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Jupiter is at least a Latin deity, but Juno we're pretty sure is 100% Etruscan. And Minerva's actually a really interesting hybrid of the two.
Okay, I'm going to give this next theory a huge caveat. Doing the research for this was incredibly difficult. I've read a bunch of scholars who all talk about this theory. But for the life of me, I cannot find a single inscription or anything backing up the idea outside of some linguistic theories. If you care about the chain of evidence, go ahead and check the companion doc. But currently, I think this is a theory postulated by one Australian etymologist in the 1930s. And the logic felt sound, so a bunch of scholars repeated it, and now it's just in the scholarly milieu. But I seriously cannot find a single piece of evidence that this moon goddess ever existed.
Linguistically, we're pretty sure she had originally been mensua, which is a Latin word referring to like counting. And she was associated with the moon, so this would be, maybe fertility, maybe menstrual cycles, something like that. Then she gets exported to Etria, and the Etruscans see her and write her as Minerva. and they kind of associate her with Athena, so more like wisdom and war. Then, when the Etruscans come back to Rome, they reintroduce her, and she supplants the old version, and they start writing her name as Minerva, which is the name by which we know her today. So, kind of interesting to see that little back and forth journey there for her. The Etruscans also had a divine triad at the head of their religion, which were composed of Tinia, a male sky god, Uni, his wife, and Minerva. So, it kind of seems like the Romans just got a copy of the Etruscan triad as their Capitoline triad. Indeed, the Etruscans seem to have no issue adopting foreign gods into their own pantheon, and were such big fans of Greece that they claimed their society had been founded by Odysseus. The evidence of this goes all the way back to the 5th century, although we're pretty sure it's older than that. In fact, they openly worshipped Greek gods. We're pretty sure that's how Castor and Pollux made its way to Lavinium. Remember when I said Greece might not have been influencing these places directly, it might have been by way of Etruria. The Etruscans didn't just give the Romans new gods, though. They also gave them new rituals, including a brand new way to listen to what the gods might be saying. Now, Romans probably already had a method of divining what the gods were thinking, or divination, if you will, that involved watching the movement of birds, called augury. Augury isn't something that the Italians necessarily came up with. We can see it all over the place. I think, I'm pretty sure like Babylonians, there's records of them doing augury and stuff. But the Etruscans had a cool new form of divination, which involved
killing an animal and ripping out its internal organs. The animals will tell you the future. If you look at the organs of animals, God exists. God is real. The organs of animals will tell you what God is thinking.
This was called haruspication and was done by haruspickers. One of the coolest Etruscan religious artifacts we have is this stone, which tells you the proper way to read a sheep's liver. This, as well as augury, would often be referred to as taking the auspices. Fun fact, this is where we English speakers get our words for auspicious and inauspicious. The auspices simply referred to how the gods felt about a particular issue, be it positive or negative. Elections could only be held if the gods said so. Business transactions might be called off if the signs were unfavorable. As for love and marriage, I mean, kids today look at folded pieces of paper, so forget about it. Kids do still do that, right? It's also possible the Etruscans brought the calendar to the Romans, although I'm going to get ahead of this one and say this is a very disputed topic, so I will link in my companion doc arguments from both sides if you want to read it. It might have been Latin in origin. The calendar to the ancient Romans wasn't just a way to keep track of what day it was. It was an incredibly important tool of the state religion. It listed all public holidays, which were incredibly important for maintaining proper relationships with the gods, at least on a state level. There's an interesting theory that if the calendar was Latin in nature, it may have just started as a way to keep track of the harvest. Keep in mind, Rome was originally just a bunch of shepherds and farmers. The calendar did not merely include agricultural deities, though. It also included days to Jupiter, Mars, Sol, Demons, the Compitalia. Look, I'm not going to list them all, but it was a lot, okay? I'll put some notes in the companion doc if you want to read the full list. But this central planning document became a very important tool for Roman religion, and it could be added to if need be. Say, a day of Thanksgiving to pray for success in a war, or a triumph. The calendar was a very public document meant to keep track of the state religion, and that's really all we've talked about up until now, the kind of big civic festivals, but the Roman religion was much deeper than that. There was a very personal element to it, and one of the most important parts of that personal element may have been perhaps not introduced by the Etruscans, but quite possibly shaped by them. The Lares. To very much oversimplify it, they were essentially just spirits that were tied to specific places, although even places is sort of misleading.
There are references to things like military Lares as well as family Lares, but these references are kind of few and far between.
But every field, crossroad, and even Rome's own neighborhoods had their own Lar. But because they were so common and mundane, they're actually not talked about that much in terms of the histories. As essentially any space had a Lar, yes, that's the singular, there were formulas for asking them for pretty much anything. Clearing space for a meadow, for example, had a really specific formula for it. Pretty much every family would pray to their household Lar every single day when they got up. They would share the same space as a lot of other household deities. One of the other most important ones is the genius. And yes, I know it's spelled genius. I'm going to say genius, even though in general I push back against these authentic Latin pronunciations because at the end of the day, No one's calling him Kike-ra.
We're going to cover the Genius much more when we get to the Cult of the Emperors, so for now just know it was a very general category and was essentially the manifestation of the spark of the divine present in all things. In terms of the home religion specifically, each family had a Genius or divine embodiment of their own ancestral line, as well as an individual Genius that each person possessed as well. The head priest of these family cults was the oldest living male relative, the paterfamilias.
This is often brought up as a reason why Rome was such a patriarchal society. At the end of the day, your oldest male relative was the one who could earn or spurn divine favor. And again, this makes sense when you think about these gods as just natural forces that you want to establish a positive relationship with. The big festivals, the big state stuff, that's for the state. That's for we get a good trade deal, we have a good war, things like that. But things like your business venture going well, you winning a bar fight or something like that, that's up to you forming your own personal relationship with these deities. Which also meant that when you were asking for things, you'd have to invoke quite a few deities just to avoid offending anyone. The easiest example to explain this is farming. Jupiter, as god of the sky, you obviously ask him to make sure you'd get rain. And then you'd also ask Ceres, the goddess of wheat, to make sure that your wheat grew. Oh, and Robigus, the god of wheat rot. You want to make sure that your wheat doesn't rot, so you got to pray to him. And also Mars, because Mars had a lot to do with the tilling of the field. And that's not even all of them. Check the companion doc if you want to see the full list. But if you thought that wasn't complicated enough, the gods also had titles, or epithets, if you want to be fancy about it, that you'd have to refer to them by depending on what you were asking them for. When you asked Jupiter for rain, he'd be Jupiter Pluvius, literally Jupiter of the rain. If you're asking for sunlight, he'd be Jupiter Lucetius. War, Jupiter Ferretius. In a recorded prayer for the safety of the Roman people, Jupiter would be referred to as Jupiter Optime Maxime, Jupiter best and greatest. However, the priest would then go on to say, or whatever title you'd wish to be called. Ultimately, the things they were trying to ask favors from were things like the rain and the sun. They didn't necessarily care who they were praying to or who was on the other side. They just knew that these rituals were the best way to pay respect to these things. It's not exactly that the rituals were written in stone, but if you wanted to change them, you needed to have a pretty good reason. Valerius Maximus, a first century historian, actually has a story that illustrates this pretty well. In it, the priest who's in charge of the annual Roman prayer for the success of the Roman people changes the formula. He omits the line, "May her borders grow ever bigger," because in his mind, Rome's borders were big enough already.
And this is why I think it was so easy for the Romans to adopt outside religious practices. If you saw a civilization that seemed more favored by the gods, what was the harm in trying their religious communication methods? And through trial and error, Rome acquired enough tools to talk to the gods themselves, setting them up nicely to stand on their own.
So sometime in the 5th century, the Etruscans left Rome, likely because there was a Gallic invasion going on in northern Italy at this time, and they needed to pull back troops to defend themselves. While later writers describe the Etruscans leaving as semi-peaceful, basically there's one Etruscan king and the entire populace turns on him and he dies and that's the end of it. There's actually archaeological evidence that there might have been a lot of fires in Rome around this time. It's easy to interpret all this as, the Romans were independent and then the Etruscans came and took them over and then the Romans kind of, fiercely rebelled. But again, I really do want to caution that the evidence is just the evidence, not the answer. It's also possible that, wildfires popped up and then Rome threw off their Etruscan kings because they said, oh, you clearly are not favored by the gods because of all these problems that are happening. So there are other explanations we can come up with. In fact, Mary Beard, one of the most influential modern Roman historians, doesn't believe that Etruscans ever ruled Rome, or frankly, many parts of Latium. She believes there was much more of a cultural exchange and says that the Etruscans really took over Rome. We should see way more Etruscan art and literature and things like this in the archaeological record. I find Rupka's argument a little bit more convincing in that around this time, Etruria was trying to expand. And again, Rome is just a really nice place to control. Again, it's up to you. All I'm doing is providing the evidence and a couple theories. You can figure out whatever you want. Regardless of how it happened, Rome was now left to her own devices. And around now is when I feel confident saying we can start seeing the emergence of a religion that we can truly identify as Roman. Though, as we'll see, this will still change in coming centuries. The best example to illustrate this comes from the oldest Roman legal document we know of, the 12 Tables, supposedly written in the mid-5th century BC. Although, to be fair, it's only survived to us in quotations from other writers, so we don't like have proof that this was written then, but these were fairly well known. The tables cover many laws from theft to slander, but in terms of religion, they don't actually say that much in terms of something we'd care about. Although there are plenty of things related to, like, don't smooth a funeral pyre with an axe, which doesn't really feel like a theology thing necessarily. So, but again, I'm going to link the whole thing if you want to read it. One law I do want to point out is grazing or stealing someone's grain before that grain is ripe. Now, what do you think the punishment for that should be? In fact, I'll give you a hint. If you stole someone's grain after they harvested it, you'd become a debt slave. Either you'd have to pay for the grain or you'd have to work off your debt accrued by stealing that grain. So what do you think? That's right. You'd get crucified and sacrificed to the gods. Why would they do this? Why would the grain not being ripe affect how severe the punishment was? So theory time, total theory here, using the framework we have of religion as a form of communication and maintaining proper relationships with these gods, I think this is probably apologizing to Ceres. Because if you assume the farmer planted the wheat and said to Ceres, hey, can you help this wheat grow? Ceres puts in all this time and work to try and help the wheat grow. And then right before it grows, some jerk comes in and basically ruins all her hard work. Back in the 5th century BC, wheat was kind of important. It was basically the thing that let most of your people live. So pissing off the goddess of wheat was basically the last thing you wanted to do. So I view this as them basically torturing this person and then sending them to Ceres, basically saying, hey, we don't like this guy either. This wasn't us. Totally disavow, our bad. Here, you take him, do what you want. Again, we're so sorry. We're never going to do this again. But again, that's just my theory. What the hell? I'm having fun. Let's do one more. It's like 3 a.m. and I have had too much coffee and it's just my body is fighting me. So let's talk about the nameless voice. I cut this one for time, but I'm going to throw it back in and we'll see if it makes the final cut. This is going to be super rambly because I don't have anything written in front of me this time. But do you remember those Gauls that the Etruscans left to go deal with? So they would not deal with them and they would make it all the way down to Rome and sack Rome. Prior to them arriving, though, there's a plebeian just kind of walking by a sacred grove, and a voice speaks out from the grove. And the voice says, hey, watch out. The Gauls are coming. You really need to reinforce the city's defenses. So the plebeian runs and finds, some like upper class Roman guy and says, a voice just told me we need to do this. So the upper class Roman guy ignores him and is just like, yeah, never mind. We're throwing you in jail. And so they don't reinforce their defenses, and the Gauls come and they sack Rome. So after that, the Senate actually has an altar built to this nameless voice, or the one who speaks or something. I feel like I'm going to get so much of this wrong now because I didn't write it down. But the voice, I think Cicero is the one who says the voice never speaks again. So basically, there was a divine entity that wanted to help Rome. And then what happened was Rome didn't hold up their end of the bargain. They basically disrespected this voice by completely ignoring the warning that the voice went out of their way to tell the Roman people. And so the voice never speaks again, and that's it. That's the end of the relationship. They keep sacrificing to it, but nothing ever happens. And I think, because again, I think this is Cicero who said this. I think it was like by the time of Augustus, basically the shrine had completely fallen into disuse, and no one really cared about it anymore. But again, interesting to just sort of show again that it was very much about respect and maintaining this respectful relationship. The god offered something freely, they were ignored, and so they were like, well, I'm fine. I'm going to take my ball and go home. And that's basically it. After this time period, we start having a lot more written records and things start to get a little bit clearer. So that's the end of the Archaic period. So as we wind down, let's review. The Latins, though never united, had a shared cultural background. This culture involved giving gods votive offerings given in fulfillment of a vow. This culture was interested in communication with these deities so that they could better achieve success in areas outside of human control. The world was populated by many of these deities, which could affect the world in both positive and negative ways. The best way to court favor and avoid disaster was to keep the gods happy. And the best way to do this was to ask the right gods about the right things, be respectful about it, and try and maintain a good relationship by constantly thanking them for the little things they were doing for you. The Sabines may have introduced a few new gods and possibly one form of divination, but we can't be sure, though there are indicators. Lastly, the Etruscans showed up and gave Rome quite a lot. Everything from their rituals to potentially their calendar to potentially even their local household gods. And that brings me to one of the first big points I really want to hammer home. Rome was not born out of nothing. Rome was born out of the cultures that surrounded it. Rome was a cultural melting pot from day one. If you take a look at it on a map, Latium was tiny compared to the other civilizations around it. And again, Rome was really just the best place to cross from northern Italy to southern Italy. As a result, it naturally just became a waypoint that a lot of cultures would move through. And their early religion reflected this. Sabine gods, Latin festivals, Etruscan rituals, all of these things came together to form what we would eventually think of as the Roman religion. As I've said elsewhere on the channel, I'm not a historian. This is just the theory that makes the most sense to me with the evidence that I've seen presented. And I've read quite a lot on it. But if you have another theory, feel free to share it with me. Heck, if I like it, I'll put it in the companion doc, even if I disagree with it. The Etruscans left to try and fight the Gauls, lost, and then the Gauls came and sacked Rome. And once the Gauls left, Rome began to grow, and grow very rapidly, often through conquering their neighbors, although the later historians would claim it was just a bunch of alliances. And once Rome grew big enough, they got to play with the big boys. And this would eventually bring them face to face with the real culture that had influenced them more than anything else. And in just a few hundred years, Rome would be Hellenized, whether or not it wanted to be. But that's for next time, when things get Greeky. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions at all, leave me a comment or feel free to send me an email. If you liked the video, like the video, and subscribe to see the rest of the series. I know I keep saying I'm going to start getting these videos out faster now. I'm just going to walk that back. I actually completely recorded this earlier, and it wasn't as good. I realized in the editing that I had missed a lot of stuff, and I realized that I shouldn't be focusing on getting them out quickly. I should be focusing on making them good. So I'm just going to keep going at my own pace. However, the rest of the series has actually already been shot. I'm currently editing this by the time you're watching this, unless it's been like a year or something, in which case it's out. So just go watch it. But yeah, part 2 and part 3 are coming very, very soon. Shouldn't take too long, probably next 2 weeks or something like that. Take care.